if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully obey all his commands I give you today, I will bless you. Man, I wish you hadn't said today. I want to wait till tomorrow. So I'd been here about 3 years, 1984, maybe 2.5, and I'm in a board meeting, one of my most favorite things. That's why I could never be a district superintendent. You have them all the time. And Elsie Buckmaster, she was the treasurer. I don't know how many decades she'd been treasurer. And we got this $250,000 debt, and every time we want to do a new ministry, oh, we can't because, we got to pay our debt. I said, I wonder how long it'll take us to pay off this debt. She says, I used to think that when we paid off the debt, I would retire from being the treasurer, but I'm now realizing I will die first. That's just what I needed. I go home, I can't forget that. God won't let me forget it. And then think, come on, Lord, maybe tomorrow you can let me sleep today, and tomorrow I'll think about it. No, I need you to think about this today. And don't you know that day I just got something in the mail about how you can be out of debt in 3 years? Even gave names you could call and said, okay, God, I'll call them tomorrow. I'm not going to wake them up tonight. It's like 11 o'clock. So the next day I got on the phone, got to calling. And man, there's one company people really like. So I called up the company and they said, yeah, we'll have somebody out there. About 3 months later, somebody showed up. We talked to them. Thought that must be really good if you have to wait 3 months. And he convinced me maybe I should have him meet with the board, especially Elsie. And what I didn't tell you was I told Elsie that night, I said, Elsie, either you're going to live a long time. I said, I just know in my heart, God wants us to get out of debt before you die. So anyway, we're all skeptical, and they talk to us and say, oh, yeah, it's really possible. It's really possible. So I'd tell the Lord, okay, Lord, I'm doing my part, but you've got to talk to the rest of the people. They say it's going to take like 60 volunteers to make this work. Dedicated volunteers that are willing to give 10, 20 hours a week. So I'll start praying about who should be the people to lead it up, and God brings to mind the people that greeted at the front door, Bertie and Helen Wilkins. Yeah. In 6 years, I never saw them frown. They were always smiling. And I saw them this morning still smiling. They've lost some weight, but they're still smiling. Now, for some of us, we would smile if they lost weight, but for them, I don't think they had that much to lose, and they're still smiling. Next thing you know, other people begin to join in, and next thing you know, man, we had, if you look out there, I think there was like 28 volunteers saying, we're willing to give up a year of our life, however much it takes, so this will be successful. And so about 6 months later, we had a banquet and we talked to people, and a lot of people didn't come because they knew we were going to talk about money. So guess what? Scott and Debbie Jackson were in charge of the visitation team. We've got to get 30 couples willing to go out, and we're going to, if you visited us in the last 10 years and we had your name and address, we're going to go knock on your door. And if your kids came on a bus, we're going to go knock on your door. And we trained them, and they were trained, and next thing you know, things are beginning to happen. The only drawback was before they would agree to come help us do that, we needed $40,000. And Elsie just about sank under the table. She heard that because we couldn't make a $4,000 payment. There was a man in the congregation, he's in his 80s. I was 35 at the time, so anybody over 50 looked old to me, but I'm guessing he was in his 80s. I'm 70 now, 80's pretty young. But anyway, and he'd had a stroke and he couldn't talk too much. And every so often he'd just interrupt my sermon. God would be in a place, he'd fill it, he'd just stand up and wave his hand and start crying. And I'm thinking, okay, God, what are you trying to tell me this time? God didn't stand up unless there was something really happening. And so God had always, his wife Vera had always told me about how, he's really smart at investing his money. In fact, he tried to tell me as good as he could with this language problem about how I should be investing my money, except I had 2 kids and I had nothing to invest but my kids, and he wouldn't take them. But anyway, kids. And I thought, Guard's the one. So I went to see Guard. I said, Guard, you're in your 80s. How would you like to do something really great for God before you die? Now, I'm just giving you the little 30-second thing. It went about an hour and a half. Long story short, God decided, you know what? I said, Guard, you're really good at actions. A lot of people talk words. You don't talk words. You use your action, and God can use your action if you just write a check now for $40,000. And so help me, within a week, I had the check for $40,000. Wow. That's when I knew we were on the edge of a miracle, folks. And Elsie Buckmaster was starting to stand a little taller now and looked like, hey, there might be hope before I die. And the next thing we know, we start doing the visitation thing. It's going really good. I mean, we trained them and all that. And this guy that kept coming, he was coming out once a week training people and all that. And they're giving of their time and their effort. And one of them was Vernon Val. I never forgot Vernon. Gloria to James, Robin Eddie's grandpa, Gloria to James' dad. He came in one night just redhead. We'd come together and we'd share stories afterwards. Some of us had good stories. Some had like, well, the dog bit me or something, but most of them were pretty good. He came in. I had never seen this guy upset in my life. All right, whose idea was it to go to these different houses? I want you to know that a policeman stopped us. He said, what are you doing? Somebody called the police on us. He said, we're shining our lights. We're trying to find an address. He said, I just told him the truth. He said, we're trying to raise money for our church, get it out of debt so we can help our community. And the policeman said, oh, that's what it is. Well, let me show you where the house is. What was your address? And he took him to the house. He says, isn't God great? I'm thinking, whoo, boy, I thought he was going to shoot me there for a minute. And instead, God's great. It was one miracle after another. And then I'm in a service one morning, and Helen Ryan interrupts me, stands up. Now, Helen is a single parent to a disabled son who she's working but not in a high-paying job. She says, I decided it's time for me to trust God with my life. I'm going to give everything I have to get out of debt so we can reach Decatur for Jesus. Oh, you try preaching after that. I wanted to say, wait just a minute, are you sure that's God telling you? Because you... Next thing you know, somebody else stood up. God took over the service. Next thing we know, people that had come 5 years ago decided to come back, but they gave money. Next thing you know, the word's getting around town. Next thing you know, our attendance is coming up. Next thing you know, we're having to put out chairs during the service. Next thing you know, and then God tells me, Dwayne, you've got the ball rolling here. You need to move. I said, wait a minute, God. There's a miracle happening. And do you know, he sent me to a church that was worse than debt. They owed money on everything they could think of. And it took us 22 years, and they were still in debt when we left. But here's the thing. I found out that just like it says in Deuteronomy, when you hear God's command and you obey, today, that was his secret. It wasn't me obeying. I did my little thing. I told Guard, if you give $40,000, Ruth and I think he wants us to give $30,000, and we don't have any money in the bank but about $400 this last month. God somehow helped us pay our pledge because we obeyed. Do you know, because people obeyed, Ron Bush came in later and was able to burn the mortgage. Mm-hmm. And we were out of debt. And God helped Ruth and I. Don't ask me how. You know what? I got calls from funeral homes. I'd never gotten calls from before. Said, hey, somebody would like you to do their funeral. It was just amazing. I just happened to have, because every week we just happened to have the right amount of money. I was privileged. I'm just a farm boy that had a speech impediment. I talked too fast. I had problems. Had to go to a speech therapist as a kid, and I thought I was going to talk to John Deere tractors. They understood me, and God called me to ministry. And while I was in 1969, Billy Graham came to Oklahoma City while I was at Southern Nazarene University, and a bunch of us from different schools, students, got to spend about an hour with him, and then with his guy that did a lot of the pre-service stuff, and he came to... Anyway, long story short, Billy Graham said, you know one thing when I get to heaven? He says, see, when I was 12 years old, an evangelist came about 3 miles down the road and set up a tent. So my friend and I decided, let's ride our bikes down and see what's going on at the tent. And he said, we looked in the tent and it was clear full. Got to remember, no TV, no radio. We're talking the 30s, folks. People went to church for entertainment, and then they got saved. Billy Graham says, we went a couple hours up the road and tent. We thought, no, this place is full, and we walked back out. He said, an usher sitting right over here where your pastor is turned around and saw us, ran back and got us before we got on our bike. Said, hey, boys, I saved the best 2 seats in the house for you. I knew you'd be here tonight. Well, they even say reserved on them. Yeah, they were reserved for the ushers and the greeters. He says, that man took us up there, treated us like we were high-quality people, sat us down on those reserved seats, and said, now you're going to enjoy this service. The music's great, and you're going to love the preaching. He says, that was a service where I knelt at an altar and accepted Jesus. He said, I can't wait till I get to heaven to shake that usher's hands and say, do you know, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be coming up here thanking you for inviting me to come sit at the front row. And some of you people who are here, when you get to heaven, it's just like the district superintendent told us this morning. Dr. Kramer told us. There are going to be people shaking your hands saying, I want to thank you because you obeyed God today. And you gave in that offering. You made it possible for us to have a church. You committed yourself to get together we could way back in the 80s. Or you did this and you did that. And guess what? You and I need to obey God today. And we'll see the blessing down the road. God bless you. Amen.
And one of his associates was Brenda Cook back then, Clark now. And she's going to come and share.
Down where the short people live. What a pleasure to be with you today. I never thought 30 years ago that I would be here. The church has come such a long way, and everything that Dr. Kramer spoke about this morning is relative to my life and how I ended up at Westside, because had it not been for 2 couples, Bob and Maxine Bennett, remember them? Earl and Vivian Tippett. They were members of the Stonington Church of the Nazarene, where I grew up, and like Westside, but Stonington was a lot smaller. You know, if you had any kind of talent at all, they grabbed you right up. So I remember, at the age of 10 or 11, starting to play for church, children's church, anything like that, being involved in Bible school and all of that. And I learned back then that missionaries weren't necessarily called to go overseas. When you give your life to the Lord, you're then a missionary, and the whole world around you is your field. And so in the early 80s, I went to work at Blue Mound, and I was a bivocational associate, always have been. There are many of us out there. And I was working at the Taylorville Church at the time, and I got a call from Pastor Smith asking me if I'd be interested in coming to speak with him about the job at Westside. And that's how I ended up here. And so I learned and continue to learn through all of that the network of people that you come into contact with have everything to do with your life, and vice versa. Everybody that you come into contact with, you need to impact them for the Lord. And in my position now, fast forward several years, I ended up going back to school and got a doctorate in curriculum and instruction, and specifically music education. And I've been at the University of Indianapolis for getting ready to start my 12th year there in the music department. And then for the last 5 years, I've been chair of the department, and then I'm getting ready to move into an assistant dean role. But in every one of those positions, in every conversation I have, I'm always able to bring things around to my faith and how I got where I am. And it's a Methodist school, but you wouldn't know it. That's just a label. But I'm so thankful for God's impact in every person who has been involved in my life. In fact, I met my husband because of another couple who were a part of this church at the time, Charlie and Marilyn Cox. You remember them? They always fashioned themselves matchmakers and would set you up on a blind date. If they knew that you were single, well, they had to fix that right away. And they tried several times, but fortunately for me, they introduced me to my husband Greg on a blind date, and we'll celebrate 30 years in December and have yet to have an argument. Now, how about that? He's a great guy. But what I learned about Westside, and I made notes, because one thing that I learned is that you have to have a 3-point sermon where you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. And so I don't want to take up the whole afternoon here, but I learned that this church was made up of people who behave their beliefs. They demonstrated in numerous ways how we're supposed to love people and value them and treat them in ways that will eventually, if they're not already there, win them to Christ and build God's kingdom. This church has always had a heart for missions, not just here, but also abroad. One of the things that I remember strongly about this church is how involved you were in the bus ministry. And after I started working here, I too ended up with a bus license so I could drive the bus. And that was quite an experience in an old manual 55-seat passenger bus. You operated it often on faith and with some good church mechanics. Names like Harold Toms, Harold and Eloise, Ed Reese, I saw Ed here, Jim Ballard, I saw you come in, Jim, Bertie Wilkins. They all made sure that bus was working, whatever it took, and they weren't always in great shape, but the point was that was our vehicle to get us to where we needed to go, to pick up people, to bring them to church. One very special memory I have in that bus was taking the teens to Branson. And if you've ever been to Branson, there's that big, long climb of a hill, and I had no mechanic with us. And that was in the days of no cell phones and things like that. And so as we started up that hill, I just kept praying, get us to the top of the hill, get us to the top of the hill, and we made it. And then when we got there, the hotel that we had was at the bottom of a hill, and we had to get up on the highway, which was up here, and it was a manual. And so I was just praying that the clutch wouldn't go out, that things would work out, but they did. And we had a great time with the teens. I'm not sure how many of them are still in this particular church, but I know that you're out there. I saw Lynn Hill and several kids like that. But I know that through all of those experiences, none of us were perfect. We're still all a work in progress. But God had a purpose for us being in those places and in those times. Another experience that I won't forget with the teens is going on a canoe trip. And we didn't take the bus, but we took several vans and things like that. And we were taking the long canoe trip. And my canoe was second to the last. And the canoe behind me was made up of Lynn Hill, I think Lori Ballard, and who was the third? Denise Wright. Well, if you've ever canoed at Turkey Run, there's a little turn right after you take off. Well, I didn't realize it, but their canoe tipped over. And they said, forget the canoe, we're going to get out and walk. And so we got to the end of the canoe trip, and we're all supposed to meet up and come back to church, or come back to Decatur together, and they didn't show up, and they didn't show up, and they didn't show up. Well, about 10 o'clock at night, there was a farmer whose house they came upon, and he knew where the landing was, where they were all supposed to come back to, and he brought them back. But for me, those are the things where, we were praying that they were okay. And that God would bring us all back safely. But through those things, even the small things in life like that, it's not just luck. It's God looking out for your life and having control over everything that you do, and showing you that it's not about you. It's about what He can do. And for me in my life, it continues to be that way with my own kids, my family, the students and faculty that I come into contact with. But all the places that He's been able to take me have been because of Him. One more thing about this church, I was a bivocational single person, and I never had any free time to myself by choosing, actually, but, I was always so very busy, but the church had a real heart for people who, like me, who were just, committed to what you were doing, but just didn't make time for themselves, and that was back in the days before cell phones and in the early days of the microwaves. And I remember one Sunday, getting up to lead the singing, and that was back in the days when we had just a piano and just an organ. And Pastor Smith interrupted the song service to bring out this microwave that I think Bertie and Helen had something to do with that. But, in order to take better care of myself, I needed something where I could make a quick meal here and there. And until just a very few years ago, we still had that microwave. It served us very faithfully. But that's what I remember most about this church is folks like that who would love on you. People like Virginia Welch. I still have a little hot pad that she made me. I think of her every time I see it. Mike and Carolyn Daniel. Now I know I think they moved to North Carolina or maybe Alabama or something like that, but they were givers. Jim and Pat Henley, who I think are related some distantly to the Jacobitz family still, but they just were committed to furthering God's kingdom in so many ways. The Hendrickers, I'm glad to meet up with you again today. They were so instrumental in the music program here. Jeff playing the organ, playing trumpet, whatever I needed him to do. His mom playing the piano or the organ, and Lorraine Hodge. Oh my gosh, what an impact you all had on my life, and that you were helpers to me. I was trying to grow the choir, grow the music program, and then ended up working as the youth director. But just all of the various ways that, all we had to do was say, "Would you?" and you would say yes. Those are the things that whatever kind of leadership role you play, whether it's in a church or in a university or whatever it is, those are the people that you really, really learn to love and value for who they are and not what they can do for you, but the fact that they are willing to do it and are givers. In this world, we learn that many people are either givers or takers, and I remember Westside Church being a church made of givers and lovers, people who love the Lord their God with all their heart and soul and mind and all their strength. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your day today, and congratulations, Westside Church.
From about 1988 to 1990 was Richard Bushy, and he's going to come and speak. He and I got acquainted in the late 90s. We pastored just a few miles apart in Missouri.
Some people called it Rolla. It really was Rolla, I think. But, what a delight it is for us to be able to be here. When I got your stationery and I saw the beautiful building, and I knew it wasn't the building that I had pastored in, and so I said, I've got to go see the building and see how many of the people. I'm shocked at how many people are still here, that were here then. I've been having more fun than a pastor ought to be allowed to have. I've told several of you that, but it is true nevertheless. So much of what has been said are the things that I kind of wanted to reflect on as well, the kind of church and the kind of people that Westside has been. Sometimes when you are in the middle of it, you don't recognize it quite the same as you do from hindsight. Anyone relate to that? I kind of think that's the way it is with my wife and I. But when we came, we were a hurting pastor and wife from a very difficult situation prior. And when we came, this church just accepted us and wrapped their arms of love around us. One of the first things they did to welcome us was to have the entire family come to the front of the sanctuary, and then everybody would come and they would use some Scotch tape, and they would tape dollar bills and $5 bills and tens, and there were a few larger quantities and a check or two on us and all the kids, and that meant so much, not because of the money, but because of the acceptance. When you're in a situation where your children are wondering what's going on and why are mom and daddy suffering like this, sometimes the children grow up and they can become bitter. I've seen it happen. Didn't happen with our children, and I think mainly because at a very, very significant time in their lives, very impressionable time in their lives, a church reached out and showed love and compassion and concern to them and to their parents, and we appreciated that very, very much. That was the kind of church that these were. We did a lot of things, programs. Every church pastor, youth pastor, they have programs. Some are a little different, some are the same. We had Bible marathons where we read the Bible through the night until we read it all the way through. The teens sponsored that. One of the highlights with the young people was when we taught them how to, I guess it was child evangelism that gave the course on how to win children to Jesus Christ. And then we took the teens to East St. Louis, or to St. Louis proper, into some of the suburbs. In a struggling church, an inner city church. They held a VBS there. And my wife says one of the highlights was watching our teenagers from Westside take little children aside in that inner city church and lead them to Jesus Christ. That's the kind of atmosphere that we found in all of Westside. Westside was pro-Christianity, pro-spirituality. And that was one of the things that I liked so much about this church and loved. As I look back and I realized you pastor, a variety of different churches, and all of them have their qualities, good sides and difficult sides, I suppose, whatever. But as you look back, you begin to focus on what was really good about that particular church. And one of the things that I noticed and loved about Westside was the fact that they provided what I would call a spiritual environment. I think my wife came up with the word, a seedbed for spiritual growth, a seedbed for love. The environment that was here was one of love. It was one of acceptance. It was one of outreach. It was something that we had not seen quite in the way we experienced it here at Westside prior to that, and several times since that as well. But so Westside stands up in our memory, stands out in our memory because of the spiritual heritage that they had. I remember coming in, looking at some of the history of it, and standing in awe some of the names that had come from Westside. And I thought, oh man, I've heard of them all my life. And now I are their pastor. Not that all of them were there at that time, but we began to look back and realize why this church had this kind of heritage. It was because of the shoulders that we were standing on top prior to that. I had to shake Dwayne's hand as he went back from speaking a few moments ago. I had no idea what you went through to help get the building paid for, and I had no idea who to thank. Now I know. I'm going to thank him. I may not see him afterwards, so I shook his hand on the way out. Thanks. I appreciate it so very much. And all of you, of course, that were behind him and helped him out. But the spiritual heritage of this church is phenomenal. I remember coming in and thinking, Geraldine Chappelle? I've heard her name all of my life in the Nazarene parsonage. And here I am her pastor? Oh, come on. She ought to be pastoring me. But what a delightful lady she was, those of you who had the privilege of knowing her. And then we had the privilege of meeting the Jacobits when they came home on furlough. And we said, yeah, that figures. They are from Westside. They fit that mold. And here I come back to the 100th-year anniversary, and there they are, fitting the mold one more time. And but again, it's because of that spiritual attitude. It's because of that mission outreach look, that compassion for the community, the bus ministry, et cetera, all that has been said already, that created an environment that was so very, very meaningful to us. And I think of what your general superintendent spoke this morning, or district superintendent spoke this morning. In fact, I thanked him for it, but said, you stole a little bit of my thunder. But it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to speak first anyway. But what he said was so very, very true because of what this church has been all across the years and what God wants to do with it in the days ahead. But there was a seedbed for salvation here, a seedbed for spiritual growth, a desire to grow, a desire to be of service. And we look back with 20/20 vision and recognize exactly what was going at that time, and it seems even greater than it did at the time when we were experiencing that. One illustration of the outreach that our district superintendent talked about this morning that goes here and there and everywhere and finally, comes back to talk to you was Jeff and Charmaine. You'll hear Jeff later. He'll get the last word, or at least one after me, I suppose. Sorry, Jeff, I didn't run this by you, but you and Charmaine will have to forgive me to get to heaven. No pressure. But I remember a tremendous lesson that God taught me through their lives and their ministry to us. I remember Charmaine came up to talk to Sharon one time and said, I believe God is talking to me about a ministry that He wants me to do with parents who have children that are struggling with what's going on in the schools and what's going on in their lives and how do I make these decisions or whatever. And she wanted to call it A Parent Love. I thought, wow, that's a good name and a good program. But immediately, we began to think, and I don't think I've ever confessed this to you all, but we began to think, okay, what is this program going to weigh in on us? What are we going to have to do to help make this happen? They kept saying that they were brand new Christians in the life of the church, and we saw them as, strong Christians and loving the Lord. But we thought, what are we going to have to do? And we don't feel like we can say no, but we're not sure we can take on anything else. And in prayer, God distinctly said, back out of it. We didn't call you. And I realized something that I probably needed to learn. It's easy for pastors to get into the Messiah complex. You don't mean to. But we were kind of thinking that it was us. I mean, after all, we were the leadership and, the pastor and whatever. And God said, back off. And then He told us when we said, well, how will they know what to do? I'm not sure they've had any experience in that area. And of course, we'd had all kinds of experience, And God said, again, I equip those I call. I don't call the equipped. You don't call the equipped, but you equip those you call. We backed away. Charmaine proceeded. She got a hold of the radio station, TV station, everybody. I mean, I didn't know what was going on. We'd backed off, did what God said. Just, let me do what I'm wanting to do through them. She wanted me to pray a prayer for this little group that was going to show up on our fellowship hall. So I said, yeah, sure, no problem. I was expecting about 10, maybe 15 people. Now we count differently, but my wife says it was about 75 that were there. I thought it was closer to 100 that was packed in that little fellowship hall. And the Lord said, see, told you so. So I prayed the prayer, and then I began to kind of open my eyes wide and watch what God was doing when He speaks to an individual and says, this is what I want you to do. You too are a minister within the life of the church. But I said that to say that was the kind of church and the kind of atmosphere and environment that this church provided so that those kinds of things could take place. Now, fast forward a little while, when I think of this being 100 years, I think, wow, 100 years, that's a lot. And then I think, wow, my mother just turned 100 in January. That is a lot of years. And I was only here for 2 years. I feel very small, I do. And yet it was those 2 years that helped mold us, helped mold our children at a very, very crucial time in their lives. All of them are serving the Lord in the church today and serving God and growing children that are now preparing for ministry. And so, yes, God is touching lives, many, many lives, and will continue to touch many lives because this church, this congregation touched our lives as well. We did have to leave, unfortunately, because we found out my wife was allergic to Decatur. Well, I say that laughingly, but she found out that she was allergic to corn and soybeans. Go figure. And so as soon as we leave, we got to get out of here fast. No, I'm kidding. But the doctor said, you're going to have to get out of here if you want to save her because it's